In July 1943, as German Panther tanks finally rolled toward the Kursk salient after months of delay, over half broke down before firing a single shot, not from enemy action, but from mechanical failures. A German officer would later write bitterly, "We waited week after week, promised victory by the new tanks." When the Panthers arrived, we saw more of them burning than fighting. This technological catastrophe was the culmination of Hitler's fatal decision to postpone Operation Citadel, waiting for wonder weapons that would doom rather than save Germany's last offensive. The winter of 1943 had been Germany's nightmare. Stalingrad's surrender in February cost the Wehrmacht an entire army, massive casualties swallowed by the frozen Volga. Field Marshal von Manstein's brilliant counterattack had stabilized the front and even recaptured Kharkov, but everyone knew this was a temporary reprieve. The strategic reality was brutally simple. Both sides stood exhausted. The Soviets had surged westward after Stalingrad, briefly taking Kharkov before Manstein's counteroffensive pushed them back. Now, in the spring mud of 1943, the front had congealed into an uneasy stalemate. But this wasn't a sustainable equilibrium. It was a loaded gun waiting for someone to pull the trigger. For Hitler, doing nothing was politically impossible. Stalingrad had shattered German morale. The home front needed a victory. The Wehrmacht needed to prove it could still win. Germany's allies needed reassurance that the Third Reich wasn't a sinking ship. Yet every option on the table carried catastrophic risk. Germany's panzer divisions were shadows of their former strength. Infantry replacements were inadequate. The Luftwaffe was being bled white defending German cities from Allied bombing. The pressure on Hitler was intensifying from all sides. His generals warned that Germany's window for offensive action was closing rapidly. The Soviets were recovering faster than anticipated, building strength with every passing week. But attacking with depleted forces invited another Stalingrad. Staying defensive meant surrendering the initiative permanently, watching as Soviet industrial might ground Germany down through sheer attrition. Hitler found himself trapped in a gambler's paradox. He had to bet, but every bet looked like suicide. The psychological toll was visible in his increasingly erratic decision-making. He would commit to an offensive, then hesitate. He would demand action, then postpone it. He cycled between grandiose confidence in German superiority and paralyzing fear of another catastrophic defeat that would unravel the entire Eastern Front. In this desperate strategic landscape, Hitler saw the Kursk salient, a massive Soviet bulge jutting into German lines, as both opportunity and trap. Strike it successfully, and Germany might regain the initiative. Fail, and the war in the East would be irretrievably lost. The question was not whether to attack, but when, and with what. The answer, Hitler believed, lay in Germany's factories. New tanks were rolling off production lines. Panthers with sloped armor that could deflect Soviet shells. Tigers whose 88mm guns could destroy enemy tanks at ranges previously unimaginable. These weren't just improvements. They were revolutionary designs that promised to restore German battlefield superiority. Hitler postponed Operation Citadel repeatedly, from May into July 1943, explicitly to await these mechanical marvels. By July, Germany had approximately 200 Panther tanks and 146 Tiger Wine tanks available for deployment at Kursk. The logic seemed seductive. If Germany waited just a few more weeks, these technological wonders would guarantee victory where conventional forces might fail. Why risk everything with yesterday's equipment when tomorrow's weapons were almost ready? The numbers looked compelling on paper. 200 Panthers with revolutionary sloped armor. 146 Tigers with guns that could kill at 2 kilometers. Plus Ferdinand tank destroyers and other advanced weapons. Surely these technological marvels justified waiting a few more weeks. But inside the conference rooms where Germany's fate was debated, the wonder weapon faith wasn't universal. And not everyone making these machines shared Hitler's optimism. Armaments Minister Albert Speer, the man who actually knew these tanks' production realities, explicitly told Hitler the Panthers were unready for mass deployment. Technical problems would be severe. The tanks needed more testing. The crews needed more training. The maintenance systems weren't ready. This wasn't pessimism. It was engineering reality. Speer was describing machines that looked revolutionary in the factory, but hadn't proven themselves beyond the test track. He was warning about systems so complex that spare parts would be scarce, and maintenance crews wouldn't know how to fix them. He was predicting exactly what would happen when these untested weapons met combat conditions. But Hitler's mind was already made up, or rather, it wasn't. He vacillated between technological hope and strategic doubt. He publicly justified the delays while privately expressing uncertainty whether even these new tanks would suffice. His command structure became paralyzed, trapped between a Führer who couldn't decide and generals who increasingly believed the operation was doomed, regardless of what equipment arrived. Meanwhile, German tank crews received a very different picture than Hitler's optimistic briefings. They heard rumors about engine fires and transmission failures during factory tests. They wondered why, if these tanks were so superior, they kept hearing about delays and technical problems. The uncertainty was worse than battle. But in the conference rooms where Germany's fate was debated, not everyone shared Hitler's technological faith. Some voices rose in skepticism, and they would prove tragically prophetic. In the planning meetings for Operation Citadel, one voice rose above the others in skepticism. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, the man who had pioneered blitzkrieg tactics, looked at the postponement plans and saw disaster. His assessment was blunt and prophetic. "I do not think that the operation will bring us any decisive success. The Russians have had time to prepare and reinforce their defenses. We should not attack." This wasn't the caution of a timid bureaucrat. This was the architect of Germany's greatest victories, warning that the very delay meant to ensure triumph was guaranteeing defeat. Guderian understood what Hitler apparently did not. Every week spent waiting for Panthers and Tigers gave the Soviets another week to dig trenches, lay mines, and position artillery. The technological advantage Hitler coveted was being buried under Soviet concrete and earth before a single shot was fired. He wasn't alone. Field Marshal von Manstein, whose brilliant counterattack had salvaged the front after Stalingrad, advocated for an earlier, limited offensive. He feared, correctly, that Soviet preparations would negate any technological advantage the new tanks might provide. General Model echoed these concerns, warning that the window of opportunity was closing with each passing day. The German High Command was experiencing something rare and telling: strategic consensus. The Panzer pioneer, the tactical genius, the frontline commander, and the production chief all agreed the delay was catastrophic. They were watching Hitler trade away Germany's most precious resource, time, for machines that hadn't proven themselves beyond the factory floor. But Hitler vacillated, caught between technological hope and strategic doubt. At one point, he declared, "I have decided to postpone the attack until the new tanks arrive," while privately expressing doubts about whether even these would suffice. This wasn't decisive leadership. It was paralysis dressed up as patience. The Führer, who had once gambled boldly on rapid offensives, now found himself trapped between the political impossibility of doing nothing after Stalingrad and the strategic impossibility of attacking successfully with depleted forces. So, he chose to wait, and wait, and wait. One tank crewman captured the growing anxiety. The uncertainty was worse than battle. "We did not trust the tanks, nor the plan." Another wrote home, "We hear promises every week. The new tanks will arrive soon. The offensive will begin soon. Victory will come soon. But all we see is more waiting." While German generals argued in conference rooms, their Soviet counterparts were doing something far more productive with the gift of time. While Hitler waited for his wonder weapons, Soviet intelligence was achieving a coup of historic proportions. through spy networks like the Lucy Ring in Switzerland, through intercepted German radio traffic, and through agents embedded in the German command structure. Stalin and Marshal Georgy Zhukov knew almost everything about Operation Citadel. The timing, the direction, the exact composition of German forces, even the arrival schedules for the new Panther and Tiger tanks. This wasn't guesswork or lucky reconnaissance. Soviet intelligence received detailed operational plans that allowed them to anticipate precisely when and where the Germans would strike. Ultra-decrypts, those precious intercepts of German communications that the British were sharing with Moscow, provided confirmation of what Soviet agents were already reporting. The Lucy spy ring, operating from neutral Switzerland, funneled information from sources within the German High Command itself. Every postponement Hitler announced, every new delay for tank deliveries, every adjustment to the attack plan, the Soviets knew about it, often within days. A German staff officer would finalize plans in Berlin on Monday. By Wednesday, those plans were on Zhukov's desk in Moscow. By Friday, Soviet engineers were adjusting their defensive positions to counter the exact German approach routes. What made this intelligence windfall truly catastrophic for Germany was how the Soviets used it. Marshal Zhukov, the architect of Soviet defense, transformed raw intelligence into strategic advantage. He knew exactly how much time he had. He knew exactly where to concentrate his forces. The contrast with German intelligence was stark and damning. While the Soviets knew everything, German intelligence catastrophically underestimated Soviet capabilities. Reconnaissance failed to detect the scale of fortifications being constructed. Estimates of Soviet strength were wildly optimistic. German commanders planned their offensive based on intelligence that was weeks out of date and dangerously incomplete. The Germans were advancing toward an enemy who knew they were coming, knew their exact route, and had spent months preparing to receive them. It was like playing poker against an opponent who could see your cards. Worse, it was like playing poker against an opponent who could see your cards and had 3 months to stack the deck while you waited for better cards that never came. Soviet counterintelligence through the NKVD ensured this remained a one-way information flow. Operational security was ruthless and effective. Leaks were suppressed. German agents were fed disinformation or eliminated. The Soviets maintained perfect secrecy about their own preparations while maintaining perfect knowledge of German plans. Armed with this intelligence windfall and blessed with time, the Soviets began constructing something unprecedented in military history. A defensive system so elaborate, so deeply layered, that it would transform the Kursk salient from a vulnerable bulge into an impregnable fortress. Every day Hitler delayed was another day Soviet soldiers dug. They excavated trenches in multiple defensive belts stretching back dozens of kilometers. They laid over 400,000 mines. They positioned thousands of anti-tank guns in carefully prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire. The scale of Soviet defensive preparations during those months of German waiting was unprecedented in military history. Over 1.3 million men from the central, Voronezh, and Steppe fronts transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress. They deployed 3,600 tanks and 2,400 aircraft, but the real advantage wasn't in mobile forces. It was in what they built. Multiple defensive belts, each several kilometers deep, layered the salient with interconnected trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions. Anti-tank ditches stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Observation posts provided overlapping fields of fire so comprehensive that no German tank could advance without entering kill zones covered by multiple Soviet guns simultaneously. Engineers constructed dummy positions to draw German fire, while actual defensive positions remained concealed until the moment of attack. They dug communication trenches connecting every position. They built ammunition depots every few hundred meters so defenders would never run out of shells. They positioned medical stations in protected ravines so wounded soldiers could be treated without exposure to German fire. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the architect of this defensive masterpiece, watched his confidence grow with each week of German delay. The same intelligence network that had revealed German plans now allowed him to position his forces with surgical precision. He knew where the Germans would strike. He knew which units would lead the assault. He knew Hitler was waiting for Panthers and Tigers. So Zhukov prepared specifically to destroy them. Soviet artillery commanders positioned their guns in carefully prepared firing positions with pre-calculated ranges to likely German approach routes. They stockpiled over 4 million artillery shells. They trained crews on coordinated fire missions designed to saturate specific grid squares where German armor would concentrate. One artillery commander told his men, "The Germans wait for their miracle machines. We trust in our trenches and our guns." Another wrote in his diary, "Every day they delay is another day we dig. Let them wait for their Panthers. We are building something they cannot break." The contrast between how each side used the delay couldn't have been starker. While German tank crews waited for Panthers that would break down before firing a shot, Soviet soldiers worked around the clock fortifying positions. While German logistics struggled with spare part shortages for tanks that hadn't even arrived yet, Soviet supply lines delivered endless tons of concrete, steel, and ammunition to the salient. While German commanders argued about whether to attack at all, Zhukov refined his defensive plans with mathematical precision. A Soviet rifleman later recalled, "We dug trenches day and night, never believing the Germans could break through." What began as anxious labor, digging frantically while wondering when the German onslaught would come, gradually transformed into confident preparation. Each completed defensive belt, each laid minefield, each positioned artillery battery reinforced the growing conviction that when the Germans finally came, they would break themselves against Soviet steel and earth. By early July, when Hitler finally gave the order to attack, the Kursk salient had been transformed. What German intelligence had assessed months earlier as a vulnerable position was now a killing ground, designed specifically to destroy the offensive Hitler had spent so long preparing. But the Germans wouldn't fully understand this until their wonder weapons finally arrived and began to fail. When the 1st Panther battalions finally reached the front lines in late June and early July 1943, the crews who had been promised invincible new weapons found themselves inheriting mechanical nightmares. Engines caught fire spontaneously. Transmissions seized after just kilometers of movement. Tracks broke under the tank's own weight. The technological salvation Hitler had waited months to deliver arrived fundamentally broken. Over 50% of the approximately 200 Panther tanks available for deployment were non-operational at Operation Citadel's start, not from enemy action, but from engineering defects that should have been caught in testing. The very machines that had justified postponing the offensive from May to July were failing before they could fire a shot in anger. One Panther commander's account captures the bitter reality. "We received our new tanks only days before the attack. Most broke down before firing a shot. This wasn't hyperbole. This was the lived experience of crews who had waited weeks for their wonder weapons, only to receive them with barely enough time to learn the controls, let alone master the complex systems or understand their maintenance requirements." The mechanical failures followed predictable patterns that Armaments Minister Speer had explicitly warned Hitler about. Engine fires erupted from overheating systems pushed into combat before proper testing. The Maybach HL-230 engine, rushed into production to meet Hitler's deadline, ran so hot that gaskets failed and fuel lines cracked, igniting the engine compartment. Crews learned to keep fire extinguishers within arm's reach at all times. Transmissions, inadequately designed for the Panther's 45-ton weight, seized under the stress of cross-country movement. The AK-7-200 gearbox was a marvel of German engineering on paper, but in practice it couldn't handle the torque demands of moving that much mass over rough terrain. Tanks that made it to the front line broke down during the approach march, their transmissions grinding to a halt kilometers from the battlefield. Final drive units failed with alarming regularity. Track links, inadequately designed for the tank's mass, snapped during cross-country movement. Panthers shed tracks like snakes shedding skin, leaving crews stranded and vulnerable. Some tanks lost tracks 3 or 4 times in a single day, requiring hours of backbreaking labor to repair while under potential enemy observation. When these Panthers did reach the battlefield, the results were catastrophic. Within days of combat, operational rates plummeted below 20% as breakdowns outpaced combat losses. Battalions that started with 40 or 50 Panthers found themselves down to 8 or 9 operational vehicles within 72 hours. The Soviets didn't need to destroy these wonder weapons. They were destroying themselves. Behind the statistics lay a logistical catastrophe. Spare parts for these new tanks were critically short before the offensive began. Maintenance crews, trained on older models, faced systems they barely understood. A Panzer III mechanic knew how to fix a Maybach HL-120 engine. But the HL-230 in the Panther was a different beast entirely. More powerful, more complex, and far more temperamental. Repair teams worked frantically under impossible conditions, but there simply weren't enough replacement components. Disabled Panthers were cannibalized for parts to keep others running. Transmissions were pulled from one tank to repair another. Engines were swapped in desperate nighttime maintenance sessions. Many tanks were simply abandoned, their crews retreating on foot from vehicles that had promised invincibility. A German officer bitterly summarized the experience. "We waited week after week, promised victory by the new tanks. When the Panthers arrived, we saw more of them burning than fighting. The technological hope that had justified the entire delay, that had given the Soviets 3 months to build their fortress, was revealing itself as a cruel illusion." The Panthers weren't alone in their failures. The entire technological package Hitler had waited months to assemble was revealing itself as fundamentally flawed, and the offensive hadn't even begun. The Panthers' problems were symptomatic of a larger systemic failure. The Tiger tanks, while more reliable, were so heavy they broke through bridges and consumed fuel at rates that strained already overstretched supply lines. Each Tiger drank gasoline like a drunkard, requiring constant refueling that tied up supply trucks desperately needed elsewhere. The Ferdinand tank destroyers, another technological marvel, proved fatally flawed in a different way. These 70-ton behemoths destroyed many Soviet tanks with their powerful 88mm guns, knocking out T-34s at ranges where the Soviet tanks couldn't even see them. But German designers had made a catastrophic oversight. They lacked machine guns for close defense. When Soviet infantry closed in, and they always closed in, the Ferdinands became expensive coffins. Soviet soldiers learned quickly: get close, climb on the hull, pour gasoline through the engine vents, drop in a grenade. Without machine guns to sweep away infantry, the Ferdinands could only watch helplessly as Soviet riflemen swarmed them. What should have been invincible weapons suffered devastating losses to what should have been their weakest opponents. The mechanical nightmares extended across every piece of new equipment Hitler had waited months to deploy. But the failures weren't just about engineering defects. They were about a logistical system that had already collapsed before the first shot was fired. Spare parts for the new tanks were critically short before the offensive even began. The supply chains that were supposed to feed these wonder weapons were strained by overextended rail and road networks that couldn't keep pace with the demands of maintaining cutting-edge technology under combat conditions. Trains carrying spare transmissions were weeks behind schedule. Trucks loaded with replacement tracks broke down themselves, stranding their cargo. Making matters worse, maintenance crews lacked experience with these new systems. The Panthers and Tigers required specialized knowledge that simply didn't exist in sufficient quantity at the front. Crews who had maintained Panzer IIIs and IVs for years found themselves confronting transmission systems and engine configurations they'd never seen before, working frantically under combat pressure, with inadequate tools and insufficient parts. One maintenance officer wrote in his diary, "We have tanks but cannot fix them. We have parts, but they are for the wrong models. We have mechanics, but they do not know these machines. It is chaos dressed up as preparation." Another recorded, "Today we received 50 replacement track links. We need 500. Tomorrow we will cannibalize 3 tanks to keep 2 running. This is not warfare. This is robbery. The results were predictable and catastrophic. Within days of combat starting, Panther battalions were reduced to under 20% operational strength. And here's the crucial detail. Breakdowns were outpacing combat losses. For every Panther destroyed by Soviet fire, 3 or 4 more sat disabled by mechanical failure. The Soviets didn't need to destroy these wonder weapons. They were destroying themselves. The logistical reality became a nightmare of abandoned hulks. Repair teams, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of disabled vehicles, couldn't possibly recover everything. Many tanks were simply abandoned where they broke down, too far behind enemy lines or too difficult to retrieve. Others were cannibalized for parts to keep a handful operational, reducing battalions to fractions of their paper strength. The technological advantage Hitler had sacrificed 3 irreplaceable months to obtain was evaporating not in the fury of battle, but in the mundane reality of seized transmissions and missing spare parts. The wonder weapons were proving to be exactly what Guderian, Manstein, and Speer had warned they would be. Unproven machines rushed into combat before they were ready. As German maintenance crews worked frantically to keep the wonder weapons operational, the date for Operation Citadel finally arrived. On July 5, 1943, after months of delay and promises of technological supremacy, the German offensive began and immediately encountered the fortress the Soviets had built while Hitler waited. At dawn on July 5, 1943, the German artillery barrage began. Operation Citadel, postponed from May, delayed again in June, finally launched in July, was underway. The wonder weapons Hitler had waited for rolled forward into the most elaborate defensive system ever constructed. Germany deployed approximately 50 divisions, including 15 Panzer and motorized divisions, attacking from 2 directions. Field Marshal von Manstein's Army Group South and General von Kluge's Army Group Center converged on the Kursk salient, spearheaded by the Panthers and Tigers that had justified 3 months of delay. Within hours, they encountered what those months had cost them. The Soviets had used the gift of time with devastating efficiency. Multiple defensive belts stretched back dozens of kilometers. Not improvised fieldworks, but engineered fortifications with interlocking fields of fire. The 400,000 mines laid during the delay now channeled German armor into killing zones where concentrated artillery waited. German tank commanders quickly realized they weren't fighting the Soviets they remembered from 1941. These weren't hasty defensive positions thrown up in panic. These were prepared fortifications built with perfect knowledge of exactly where the Germans would attack. Every approach route was covered. Every potential breakthrough point was reinforced. Every weakness in German armor, and the Panthers and Tigers had many, was anticipated and exploited. Prepared positions allowed Soviet anti-tank guns to engage the new German tanks at optimal ranges. Soviet gunners had spent weeks training on mock-ups, learning exactly where to aim at a Panther to penetrate its armor. They knew the lower hull was vulnerable. They knew the turret ring was weak. They knew the engine deck would burn if hit. And they had months to position their guns in concealed positions with perfect fields of fire. The psychological contrast was stark. A German officer captured the uncertainty pervading his ranks. We did not trust the tanks, nor the plan. The mechanical nightmares that had plagued the Panthers during their rushed deployment continued in combat. Tanks that survived the minefields often didn't survive their own engineering, breaking down under combat stress. Meanwhile, Soviet defenders who had dug trenches day and night, never believing the Germans could break through, discovered their confidence was justified. One Soviet rifleman later recalled, "When the Germans finally came, we were ready. We had been ready for weeks. Every trench was perfect. Every gun was positioned. Every mine was laid. We watched them come, and we knew they would die." The Soviets met the German assault with over 1.3 million men, 3,600 tanks, and 2,400 aircraft. But numbers alone don't capture the disparity. The Germans were attacking into a fortress built during their delay, using unreliable new equipment against an enemy who knew exactly where and when they were coming. Soviet intelligence had transformed preparation into science. Every technological edge gained during the delay, the superior armor of the Tigers, the powerful guns of the Panthers, was negated by the defensive advantages the Soviets had built. A Panther might have better armor than a T-34, but that didn't matter when it was immobilized in a minefield and being pounded by artillery from 3 directions. A Tiger might kill at 2 kilometers, but that didn't help when Soviet anti-tank guns were concealed at 500 meters with perfect ambush positions. The opening days revealed an arithmetic that German generals had predicted, but Hitler had ignored. The time trade Hitler had made was now undeniable. Germany had received hundreds of unreliable tanks. The Soviets had received 3 months to prepare the perfect killing ground. The opening days of Citadel revealed the delay's true cost. Every technological advantage Germany had gained was negated by the defensive advantages the Soviets had built. But the arithmetic of defeat would become even clearer as the battle progressed and German losses mounted. The numbers from Operation Citadel tell the story of the delay's consequences with brutal clarity. In 2 weeks of combat, Germany lost between 50,000 and 60,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. Over 300 tanks were destroyed or disabled. More than 200 aircraft were shot down. These weren't just statistics. They represented the Wehrmacht's last concentrated striking power on the Eastern Front, expended in a battle German generals had warned against for months. Each casualty was a trained soldier Germany couldn't replace. Each destroyed tank was a Panther or Tiger that had justified the delay but failed in combat. Each downed aircraft was a pilot with years of experience who would never fly again. The Soviet losses were numerically higher, between 177,000 and 254,000 casualties, with 1,500 to 1,700 tanks lost, and somewhere between 500 and 1,000 aircraft shot down. On paper, the Soviets had suffered more. But the arithmetic of war isn't just about raw numbers. It's about what you can afford to lose and what you can replace. Germany couldn't replace what it had lost. The panzer divisions that attacked on July 5th represented years of careful rebuilding after Stalingrad. The Tiger and Panther crews who survived were irreplaceable specialists who understood complex systems that barely worked. The Luftwaffe pilots shot down over Kursk had been training since before the war began. Every loss was permanent. Every casualty was a hole in Germany's defenses that would never be filled. The Soviets, by contrast, possessed something Germany lacked: industrial depth and strategic reserves. Behind the Voronezh and Central fronts stood the Steppe front, fresh armies that hadn't even entered the battle yet. Behind those armies stood the factories of the Urals, producing thousands of T-34s every month. Behind those factories stood a population mobilized for total war and Allied convoys delivering American trucks and British raw materials. The material expenditures told the same story. Germans expended over 3 million rounds of tank ammunition trying to break through. The Soviets fired over 4 million artillery shells in defensive operations and counterattacks, with millions more in reserve. Germany was scraping the bottom of its strategic barrel. The Soviets were just getting started. The most damning arithmetic wasn't in the casualties or the destroyed equipment. It was in what the battle represented strategically. Germany had gambled its last offensive capability on a battle it had been warned would fail. The Wehrmacht had committed its best divisions, its newest equipment, its most experienced commanders to an operation that Guderian had predicted would bring no decisive success. And Guderian had been right. The operation brought no decisive success. It brought catastrophic losses Germany couldn't afford. It brought the permanent loss of strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. It brought the beginning of the end. But these numbers, devastating as they were, don't capture the full strategic catastrophe. The delay had cost Germany something more precious than tanks or even trained soldiers. It had cost the Wehrmacht its last chance to shape the war's outcome in the East. Behind the statistics and strategic assessments were human beings whose lives were shaped by Hitler's decision to wait. Their letters, diaries, and memoirs reveal the psychological toll of the delay and the battle that followed. A German officer captured the bitter irony perfectly. "We waited week after week, promised victory by the new tanks. When the Panthers arrived, we saw more of them burning than fighting." This wasn't hyperbole. This was the lived experience of men who had spent months anticipating technological salvation, only to receive mechanical disasters. Tank crews who had waited in camps, training on obsolete equipment while being told the new Panthers would change everything, finally received their wonder weapons just days before the offensive began. One Panther commander wrote home, "They gave us these new tanks on Tuesday. On Wednesday, we were supposed to be experts. On Thursday, we attacked. By Friday, my tank was burning, and half my crew was dead. The tank didn't die from Russian shells. It died because the transmission seized and we couldn't move. We sat there like a target at a shooting range." The psychological corrosion spread through every level of the German command. Senior commanders like Guderian, Manstein, and Model watched their warnings ignored, mounting frustration, giving way to resignation as the offensive they had opposed became inevitable. They had told Hitler the delay would doom the operation. They had been right. But being right brought no satisfaction, only the bitter knowledge that their expertise had been subordinated to technological hope. Frontline troops faced declining morale amid harsh conditions, knowing their generals doubted the plan they were ordered to execute. One infantry soldier wrote, "The officers don't believe we can win. The tank crews don't trust their tanks. But we are ordered to attack anyway. What kind of plan sends men into battle when everyone knows it will fail?" Logistical staff worked exhausting hours struggling with constant shortages, trying to keep vehicles operational that were designed to fail. Maintenance officers recorded their frustration in diaries and reports. One wrote, "We are mechanics, not magicians. They give us tanks that break down every 50 kilometers and expect us to keep them running with no spare parts, no tools, and no time. It is impossible." Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, the delay worked a remarkable psychological transformation. A Red Army rifleman recalled, "We dug trenches day and night, never believing the Germans could break through." What began as anxious anticipation evolved into confident resolve. Soviet soldiers described the transformation in their letters home. One wrote, "At first we were afraid. We heard the Germans were bringing new tanks, new weapons, that nothing could stop them. But every day they delayed was another day we dug. Every week we grew stronger. By the time they came, we were not afraid anymore. We were ready." Each week of German delay meant another defensive belt completed, another minefield laid, another artillery battery positioned. Soviet commanders felt increasingly empowered, their defensive preparations validated by intelligence confirming German plans. The waiting that corroded German confidence built Soviet determination. Civilians in the Kursk region suffered their own catastrophe. Forced evacuations tore families apart. Villages were destroyed in the preparation of defensive zones. Thousands fled westward, carrying what they could on their backs. Others joined partisan groups, fighting behind German lines. Many found themselves trapped in the crossfire when the battle finally came. One civilian woman recorded in her diary, "They came and told us we had one day to leave. One day to abandon everything we had built, everything we knew. We walked for 3 days. Behind us we could hear the guns. We didn't know if our home still existed or if it had been destroyed. We didn't know if we would ever return." These personal accounts reveal what the strategic analyses sometimes obscure. The delay didn't just change military calculations. It transformed the psychology of both armies, draining German confidence while building Soviet resolve. The wonder weapons Hitler waited for arrived not as instruments of victory, but as symbols of misplaced faith, their mechanical failures reflecting the deeper strategic bankruptcy of the entire operation. The long-term consequences would extend far beyond Kursk itself. Operation Citadel was supposed to be Germany's return to offensive dominance in the east. Instead, it became the Wehrmacht's last major offensive operation on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, Germany would never again mass sufficient forces for a strategic attack. The arithmetic was devastating and permanent. Those 50,000 to 60,000 German casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, represented losses Germany could not replace. The 300 to 350 tanks destroyed or disabled included not just the mechanical disasters of the Panther battalions, but also the experienced crews and commanders who couldn't be recreated in factories. The Soviets, despite suffering higher numerical losses of 177,000 to 254,000 casualties and 1,500 to 1,700 tanks, possessed something Germany had already lost: the industrial capacity and strategic reserves to absorb such punishment and come back stronger. Within weeks of Kursk's conclusion, Soviet factories had replaced the lost tanks. Within months, new conscripts had filled the ranks. The Red Army that emerged from Kursk was stronger than the one that entered it. Germany emerged weaker, permanently weaker. The panzer divisions that had spearheaded the attack were shadows of themselves. The Luftwaffe had lost irreplaceable pilots. The infantry divisions had been bled white. And most critically, the strategic initiative had passed to the Soviets and would never return. But the material losses told only part of the story. The psychological impact cut deeper. German troops and commanders who had been promised technological salvation experienced a sharp decline in confidence that no amount of propaganda could reverse. The uncertainty one officer had described, worse than battle, had transformed into bitter certainty. Germany had lost the initiative and would never regain it. Soviet confidence soared. The Red Army that had anxiously dug trenches day and night during the delay now stood victorious. Their defensive triumph was amplified by propaganda, portraying Kursk as proof of socialist industry's superiority over fascist desperation. Soviet newspapers celebrated the victory. Stalin declared it a turning point. Soldiers who had defended the salient became heroes. The morale impact rippled through both armies. German soldiers began to question whether victory was even possible. Soviet soldiers began to believe they could win. That psychological shift would prove as decisive as any material advantage. The post-war memory became almost as contested as the battle itself. German historiography often blamed the wonder weapon delay for the defeat, a convenient narrative that suggested the operation might have succeeded if only Hitler had acted sooner, if only the Panthers had worked as promised. This narrative allowed German generals to escape responsibility by pointing to technological failure rather than strategic misjudgment. Soviet historiography celebrated Kursk as evidence of Red Army superiority, the moment when German technical advantage collapsed against Soviet determination and planning. Soviet accounts emphasized the defensive preparations, the intelligence triumph, the courage of Soviet soldiers. They portrayed Kursk as proof that socialism could defeat fascism through superior organization and willpower. But the generals who had warned against the operation knew better. Guderian's prophecy, that the Russians would have time to prepare and the attack would bring no decisive success, had proved tragically accurate. Manstein's fear that Soviet preparations would negate technological advantages had been realized. Models warning that the window of opportunity was closing had been vindicated. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.